What up, gang? Thank you for tuning in. We are on episode 18 of the Art of Life podcast, which is absolutely crazy to think about. And I say that every week because every week it blows my mind. I'm feeling a little bit like I'm dealing with not maybe a little bit of burnout, but a little bit of like writer's block. And whenever I've had artists in my life or friends in my life that have had issues with artist block, I always tell them, or creativity blocks, you have to create. And so I've been racking my brain. And one of the reasons is my mind's been pretty preoccupied with like some of the things, some of the projects I'm working on, where a lot of the time I spend time like digesting various sources of like books or audiobooks or podcasts or conversations. I've been pretty sheltered and homebody and just grinding on this project. And so I've had this writer's block, and today, I was stressing. I said I'd release an episode every Monday at midnight, and I didn't know what I was going to talk about. So I went for a coffee, and I went to Henderson Mall, which is like a very Chinese mall. There's like Chinese food and Chinese vendors, just to get a coffee and like a little, treat and sit and contemplate life a little bit. And I had to go to the washroom, so I walked through the mall, and I noticed I'm getting stared at a lot, right? Like I'm half Chinese, half French Canadian. Chinese culture is like pretty conservative, so I'm very used to like in that culture being stared at a lot. And if you've never seen me before, I got dreadlocks, I'm covered in tattoos, I got some pretty wild and facial hair, and I make some pretty bold choices with my fashion. And that gave me the idea about this week's episode. And it's why is aesthetic so important to me and why I think it should be important to everyone. And that's what we're going to talk about. So first and foremost, I remember when I first started getting into fashion, the reason it was so exciting for me was it was a form of self-expression. So as I was like a really awkward kid, and as a teenager, I really liked fashion, and I explored all kinds of hairstyles and all kinds of different aesthetics, but it was a journey of self-discovery about how I wanted to show up in the world and how I wanted to be perceived. And I remember this was like a commercial for a store, and it was like, it said, fashion is the external representation of how you feel internally or who you are, which I thought I really liked at that time. And it's something I never forgot about, because that's the reality is like we humans are programmed, like everything we do is a survival mechanism, right? Our emotions are survival mechanisms. Everything we do is a byproduct of trying to survive. And one of those things is we make assumptions. One of those things is we create stories. And one of those things is like we really make quick impressions of people. Is this person safe? Is this person my tribe? Is this person someone I want to get to know? And so I looked into it, and research shows it's less than a second. It's actually 1/10 of a second when you make an impression of someone. I heard this quote recently. Our brain is a supercomputer, but just like very little RAM. So we get to have like one thought at a time. You can't have more than one thought at a time. But when we see someone, we're digesting a ton of information, because you're seeing like their height, their weight, their physique, their clothes, their features, right? And that's why when you look at like police reports, when someone sees something crazy, everyone has like a different story, because we can only absorb data at a specific rate. So we make first impressions very quickly when we meet people. In that 1/10 of a second, we make assumptions. And if you don't believe me, think about it. When you're walking around, you see someone and you see their body language, you see how they're dressed, what they're carrying, if they're clean, how they smell, what they look like, how they're interacting with the world, these are all factors. And so we're so quick to make assumptions, which is not a bad thing. It's a survival mechanism, and I'm aware of it, right? And so I chose to have a very peculiar aesthetic that is me. You can look at me, and in less than a second, the way I choose to dress, the way I choose to have my hair, the way I choose to carry myself, my tattoos, my facial hair, these are all things that like will tell you a lot about me immediately before I even open my mouth. Before you even make eye contact, you will have some kind of assumption about who I am. And the rest of the time as you're watching me or talking to me, you're either getting reinforced that your initial judgment was correct, or you're being, your brain's going, hey, maybe we're wrong. But that's the reality. And so we all have to keep in mind that like that's how we show up in the world, and how we show up in the world is what allows our opportunities to come through, right? Like many deals in this world that change people's lives are based off of handshakes where they've got met haphazardly. So why is aesthetics so important to me? Well, one, I said it's like about cultivating my identity and knowing how quickly people make first impressions. I really want to stand out, and I want to say I wear who I am. The things about me say a lot about who I am. Like the fact that I have dreads and dress the way that I do it's a pretty surefire that I don't work a normal job. It's pretty surefire that I'm pretty unconventional. And I think that's just given me opportunities in this life. I think I've had people approach me, like not that long ago, someone approached me just outside of a coffee shop, and he's like, hey, you like a young kid, he was like 21, and he was just like, I just want to talk to you because you look interesting. I was like, oh, cool, like, let's chat. But I don't think that would have happened to me had I kind of gone with the herd, right? Standing out has pros and cons, and boosts my confidence. That's another really big thing. Like, when you feel good about what you're wearing and how you look, you carry yourself differently. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about in this episode, I remembered an experiment. So I went and dug into finding the details. And this is kind of a trend you'll notice reoccurring on the Art of Life podcast, is my brain's weird. And I remember experiments or anecdotal things I've heard. And sometimes I'll go dig in and find out that thing's not real. Or I'll find out actual research, and then I usually don't read the whole research paper. I usually either rip through it really quick and read parts of it, or I look for someone who's kind of summarized it. But there's an experiment called the Dartmouth scar experiment. It's got a way more complicated name. I didn't even bother remembering it. But basically, these psychologists had 27 men and 21 women participate in this study, and they sat in a room with no mirrors. And they had a makeup artist draw a big scar on their face. When I say draw, I mean all the FX stuff, make their scar look very real. And they had a pocket mirror, flipped the pocket mirror, showed it to them. They're like, wow, I look really disfigured. Close the mirror. And then the makeup artist go, hold on, I got to finish something. I got to touch this up. And when they did that, they took off the scar. And so then they went out into the world, in the building, wherever it was, and they went and talked to people. I don't know for what length of time. But when they came back, overwhelmingly, almost all of them reported that everyone was staring at their scar, which, as you know, was not there anymore. And furthermore, that everyone was actually mean and rude to them, based on the assumption that they thought they had a disfigurement. So that kind of ties to that confirmation bias that we've talked about priorly. But it shows you that even if what I'm wearing is whack, if I think I look good, I move different. If I think I look good, I interact with the world with more confidence. And that's something I notice in people all the time. And I tell people all the time, especially as a martial arts coach, is people come to martial arts to be empowered. And that's one of my favorite parts about my job, is I'll see the way people change in how they show up in the world. And I remember when I first started getting into I've been doing martial arts my whole life. When I first started lifting, because I was really self-conscious about being overweight, and I started feeling myself, and I started being strong. And I had friends at the gym. They weren't really friends. They were acquaintances, because they were way older than me, because I was 13 working out. But they would hype me up. And that confidence, I remember my dad picking me up and him being like, you walk different. And not really knowing what that meant then, because I was pretty young. But I think back to that and I was like, oh, I see that all the time. I see people hold their arms and look down. You're literally making yourself small, you don't want to be seen. Versus someone who's got that confidence, be seen, look at me, I'm going to stand my ground, I want to be noticed. Because we all have our own personal brands, we all have our own personal aesthetics, we all have our own tastes, and that's something that should be celebrated. I've made a lot of really good friendships as a byproduct of my aesthetic, because they're conversations that were struck up from people who kind of look like me. And I remember reading Steve Aoki's book, I think it's called Blue. And I was reading the book and I was like, man, I really like this guy. I really like this book. This is so interesting. And someone was telling me, they're like, I'm not surprised. Because if you guys look alike, you probably have a lot in common. And that was an aha moment. And that was 2019, maybe 2020. I don't remember when the book came out. But yeah, so if you're seeing someone that looks like you, makes similar aesthetic choices to you, moves in similar capacity, you probably have a lot in common. And another thing about aesthetics that's so important to me is tattoos. I got my first tattoo. It was a half back piece. It was a koi when I was 18 years old. And I've wanted that koi tattoo since I was 13, before I got ill. And it was so important to me. And originally I wanted it as a sleeve. So when I was 17, 18, I thought I was going to be a doctor. I was really good in biochem. That's what was interesting to me. And through my whole medical journey, I learned a lot about healthcare. And that was how I wanted to serve the world. And a lot changed since then. But that's why I decided to get a half back piece. And tattoos were always, to me, I remember hearing, your body is the temple of your mind and spirit. And that's it. Like, our body is a sacred vessel for that, for our mind and spirit. And there's a lot of digging into this. Like, are we our thoughts, or are we experiencing our thoughts? Are those two different entities? Or our thoughts could be perceived as viruses that transmute through like word and language and typing, right? And communication. And we could just be those things experiencing that. We're just experiencing our emotions. Anyways, that's a whole tangent, but coming back, right? If my body is the temple of my mind and spirit, I want to decorate it in a capacity that's going to tell the stories of the life I've lived, the values I've held dear, and the stories that made a difference in my life. And the koi tattoo was really important to me. And Koi Fish Prophet, I wrote, which is like now how I'm known on like social media. It's now like people call me Koi all the time, because it was a story that like resonated with me before it resonated with me. So the story of the koi is like the origin of the dragon. Kois are said, and this is all like Japanese mythology, but you know, every third moon along the Yellow River, koi would swim up the Yellow River, you know, which is like the longest river in the world. And there was said to be a waterfall, and it would swim up the waterfall, and many would die on the trek, but all of them were doing this. And they'd fall off the waterfall and make noise, and that would attract demons. And demons love to watch suffering. And so they'd make the waterfall taller and taller and laugh. And then, you know, every few hundred years, or I don't know what the time frame was, a koi would make it over the top of the waterfall. And it was said to be at the top of this waterfall a golden gate. As the carp leaped over the gate, its head would get struck by lightning, and it would grow a dragon's body. And then it would be able to, you know, live life as a dragon, right? Like fly through, gather pearls of wisdom, guard the imperial lands, whatever dragons do, right? Very different than a fish. And that story to me was just how I saw myself. I've always seen myself as the underdog, and I've always felt like there was something really special about me, especially when I was young. And then when I went through all my health stuff, which we've touched on a couple other episodes, it was just like that story about determination, going against the flow, and never giving up. And through that process, becoming a dragon just meant so much more for me. So I'm not sure if I talked about this prior, but my grandfather was a really big influence for me, because when I was young, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And he told the doctors, like, you guys aren't doing chemo on me. I don't have cancer. Like, don't touch me. And he went and did all kinds of alternative medicine. He started researching himself. Like, as far as like being your own advocate, that was the example that taught me that I needed to do that for my own health. And ultimately, like, pancreatic cancer, especially the stage he was considered to be at, tends to be like very fatal very quickly. And he lived a lot longer. I think he lived like another like 12, 13 years after that. I don't know the exact dates, but I was so young. But it was an important lesson. And that was kind of like the koi. So for my grandfather's 82nd birthday, I went and got that tattoo. I started the tattoo. I didn't finish it. And I remember telling him about it. And he was like kind of upset that I got tattooed, because he was like, you know, conservative Chinese man. But as I talked to him more about the story, and like my whole family was kind of like that. They were kind of like, whoa, tattoos. And as I grew up, they saw the value. They saw how important it was to me. Because every single tattoo I have, I've got a couple like joke tattoos and stuff, but they're either like promises, memories, lessons, or values. And I always think to myself, as archaeologists uncover bodies, we learn a lot about that society. 1,000-year-old bodies. We find a caveman body as an example, right? Or a pharaoh. I always thought to myself, if I could be frozen in time and they could find me 1,000 years from now, they could say a lot about who I was as a person without knowing anything about me. If they were to dissect how my physique was, right? Like how the muscles in my body and the balance of such has been placed, they could tell a lot about like what motions I did repeatedly. If they look at my scars, they can tell a lot about the type of life I've lived. If they could see my tattoos, they could tell a lot of the values and my profession and all sorts of things like that. And just like injuries, right? Like times I've fractured, broken, torn things. Like you can see that in a body. And so I want this vessel that is so sacred to be an absolute representation of who I am, the life I live, and the values I hold dear. And that's why I think aesthetic is something that like is seen as shallow, right? Or when people go down the spiritual path, people are like, oh, but like you're still buying clothes, or like, because it makes you feel good. And the whole point of talking about that experiment earlier, when you think you look bad, everyone, you're confirming that bias and you're going to move like you look bad. If you think you look good, and you could be wrong. Beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. Like, I wear outfits sometimes that are pretty wild, and someone else might think it's whack, and someone else might think it's awesome, but it's how I feel in it and what I think it says about me. Those are my thoughts today. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Another short episode, and they're going to get longer, they're going to get better. I'm just, right now, really grinding and going through a little bit of a creative rut, but I'm showing up every week like I promised, and it's going to keep getting better. Thank you guys for your support. It truly means the absolute world to me. This last week, I've gotten a lot of support about the podcast. I've had people message me about things they wanted me to talk about, which makes me super happy. I've had people message me about the difference, especially like the last episode I did about like, hey, stand your ground and love yourself. You don't need to bend your will. I like woke up one day, I had 2 texts from people I care about dearly that, that made a difference for me today, and I'm really happy about that. I'm doing a lot more social media stuff. We're clipping the podcast, all the podcast updates when I'm doing new things, when I maybe have guests in the future, who knows, as the podcast grows, will be on our social media. So both TikTok and Instagram, it's at AOL Podcast, funny AOL, Art of Life, not the internet thing. And ending the episode with a quote, and it's an Alex Hormozy quote. I talked about our last episode. I've been really down this Alex Hormozy hole lately, but he says, nobody loves epic heroes without epic monsters. And it's a reminder that, like, no matter what you're going through in this life that's really difficult, this current battle that you're dealing with, when I first heard it, I'm like, okay, it's about the story, right? You want to be an epic hero, you want to have an epic life, you're going to have epic monsters. But it's like more than that as you ponder it, because who you become is a byproduct of the battles you face in this world. So you only become an epic hero through the battles with the epic monster. So if you're going through shit right now, just know you're being forged. You're being forged, and you get to pick what you get forged into. So, like, how are the challenges that you're going through in your life right now going to allow you to show up in the world differently? What are you going to change about yourself? Or, like, refine. You don't necessarily have to change anything about yourself. Keep going with what serves you. I love you guys all so much listening to me week in and out, and signing off with that powerful quote, and I will see you guys next week. Cheers.